Hi, I'm Melissa Hortman. We're very concerned that Republicans appear to be escalating this situation to the point that they're going to take unlawful action on the first day and actually disregard Minnesota Secretary of State and potentially even conduct a kangaroo court in the Minnesota House of Representatives. And it's outrageous that they're trying to use this 2-week, one-vote edge that they have to potentially kick out duly elected members and to try to seize control for 2 years, which would completely ignore the will of the voters. Democrats have offered a compromise that would allow Republicans to conduct themselves as though they are a majority, even though they don't have 68 votes for the weeks of the session where they have that one-seat edge. And then after we return to 67-67, we would revert to the power sharing agreement that we negotiated. We think that this is a reasonable compromise and that instead of escalating conflict, that Republicans should get back to the negotiating table. I think the Minnesota Senate set a really good example this morning with when we are tied, we share power. And in the Minnesota House, we should do the same thing. With that, I'll turn it over to Jamie Long.
Hello. So we, I think, are seeing the really unprecedented actions of the GOP, which is unfortunately forcing our hand. And we saw, as the leader Hortman said in the Senate, that when there was a tie presented to that body, they came to the conclusion that they were going to work together on power sharing. We know that a tie is likely coming in 2 weeks, and yet this morning we heard from Lisa Dameth that she said that won't matter. She's going to be Speaker for 2 years and exercise power as if they were in charge for 2 years. We also know that they have not said definitively what they're going to do with Representative Tabke, and Leader Dameth on an interview said that she was going to, regardless of what the court said, move forward with trying to kick out a duly elected member and denying the voters of that district their representative. We also know, as of their letter today to Secretary Simon, that they are planning, likely, to bum rush the gallery tomorrow, the speaker's rostrum, try to take over as if they are in a position where they have had a legitimately elected speaker in that situation, when we know that is contrary to statute, that is contrary to Minnesota Constitution. So these steps that we are seeing are unprecedented and really outrageous from the GOP, and we really hope that they are able to come back and acknowledge the position they're in, which is that we are going to be in the position of having shared power. Leader Hortman has made a very generous offer that for the first several weeks there could be a position where they would be able to have an election of Leader Dameth into a position of power that's very similar to what the Senate did, and we should see them come back to the table and act like their Senate GOP counterparts.
Happy to take questions.
When and where are you going to meet with Leader Dameth?
We're going to meet later this evening. We'll have to double check exact time and location.
You held a swearing-in last night without any public notice. How do you justify that from a public transparency standpoint?
Yeah, we were hoping that that wouldn't be needed, and we're still hoping that that fact that we got sworn in last night won't be needed. We scheduled it to be confidential so that we wouldn't have any security issues with Republican activists trying to block the activity. And again, we scheduled it very late so that it would be at the end of what we thought the negotiating period would be, and we actually anticipated that we would be canceling that. It's sort of an emergency backup plan in case we do have to deny quorum, which we are still hoping that we won't have to do.
What specific part of Minnesota law allows you to do that outside of the first day of session?
Sure. The long-standing practice of the Minnesota House of Representatives is that people are sworn in at all sorts of different times. If they can't be there on the first day, they get sworn in at a different time. I personally have sworn in several members, other than on the first day in 2019, Representative Bierman in 2023, Representative Bliss, and there's certainly times throughout Minnesota history where, due to unique circumstances, people have been sworn in at other places at other times. There was a father and son judge duo who swore each other in off-site because they wanted to be able to do that. Judge Burke referenced an instance with a person who had an older relative who wanted to be present at a swearing-in like that.
If Republicans disregard the Secretary of State tomorrow, what options do you guys have? What would that look like? How would you guys move forward with that situation?
We would be forced to pursue action in court to declare that the House was not duly organized.
How long could the process take?
I don't know.
During this temporary majority, would the Republicans then also be able to take temporary control committees as well?
If they disregard state law and they disregard Steve Simon and attempt to run a kangaroo court, they could have pretend committees and they could have a pretend leader and a pretend presiding officer. But Minnesota law is pretty clear that the Secretary of State convenes the legislature or the Minnesota House of Representatives, and they do not have a quorum. It's like we're, kind of in the white lines of the football field, and they don't like how the game is going, so they'd like to argue that the white lines should be somewhere different. They're just really not negotiable.
But I mean, in regards to the agreement that you put forth where they could, have a speaker in this first few weeks, would that also, as part of that agreement, also the committees?
So what I've proposed is that for the first 3 weeks where they have the one vote edge, but not a majority, they have 67, that they would function as though they were a majority. They would elect Dame a speaker on the first day. They would chair all of the committees. We could temporarily go down one DFLer on each of the committees, so they would have a one vote advantage on each of the committees. And then when the period of the imbalance is over, that we would revert to the power sharing provisions that we've already negotiated. What we need, though, as Democrats, is assurance that they will do that. Because if we go in and they take actions on the first day, they're saying, we will negotiate with you later, but we have absolutely no leverage later, because once they elect a speaker, they could fire our staff, they could kick us out of our offices, they could change the rules, and when we get back to a tie, any motion would fail on a tie. So we would never be able to undo anything they did with the temporary leadership. So that's why it's so important to us that there's an agreement that says, hey, during that 3 weeks, you want to be in charge? Go ahead and be in charge. But when we go back to the tie, that we're governing together exactly like the Minnesota Senate did.
And when you all have asked them those questions, they have said that they will do those things. So when you've asked them, are they going to fire staff? They haven't denied it. When you've asked, are they going to reorganize the committees? They've said yes. When you've asked, are you going to rewrite the rules? They said, we're thinking about it. When you've asked, are they going to be taking over power for 2 years? This morning, Leader Damon said yes. So they are not acting as if they are going to come to the table and recognize power sharing, and we need to get them to agree to that.
You said that when you started that Republicans have escalated this. They say your side escalated this with the secret swearing in last night. How do you respond to what that did to these negotiations?
Well, I think that's a little silly. The swearing in is a ministerial act, and it's not really that big of a deal to have it happen in a different location. It has happened with their members. It has happened with our members. So that is kind of minor. Representative Dameth knew since December 23rd that we were contemplating denial of quorum. If we are forced into a position where the only thing we can do is deny quorum, we obviously had to take steps to get our members legally and properly sworn into office, and obviously we would do that. So I'm surprised by their reaction. I think their public overreaction may be a bit of acting, because what they've put out this morning in this letter to Steve Simon is truly outrageous. And so I think they saw an opportunity to try to say that our unorthodox swearing in was something bigger than it actually is. But ignoring the Secretary of State's presiding authority on the first day of session is beyond unorthodox. It violates Minnesota law.
Do you think a member of the executive branch should have that much control over what happens in the legislative branch?
Minnesota state law gives the lieutenant governor the office of presiding officer in the Senate on the first day, and it gives the Secretary of State the authority to govern in the Minnesota House on the first day as presiding officer. This is all because Republicans are wrong on the issue of quorum. I get that they feel that they're backed into a corner, but instead of lashing out and proposing to throw out the rule book and the law book here in Minnesota, why not come back to the negotiating table, tell us what they want, and work out a deal that provides a win-win so we can all get to work right away.
Who was the member of the caucus that took the oath on Friday?
Representative Heather Keeler took the oath on Friday because she lives in Moorhead, Minnesota, and could not be here on Sunday evening.
Well, beyond the quorum issue, they also say that you guys created this yourselves by running someone, by cheating, by running someone who didn't live in the district, so.
That's a bizarre allegation. So an individual who ran as a Democrat had an election contest and was found to have not lived in his district. We did not recruit this individual. We told all of our members that, and all of our candidates, that they needed to live in the district, believed that this individual lived in the district. And to allege that that's somehow something that we did is kind of silly, because why in the world would we go recruit somebody who doesn't live there or who couldn't prove that they live there to run in a district we're going to win with 65% of the vote? So this has happened, and then the question is, what's the result? The Republicans believe that they're entitled to act as though they are a 68 vote majority because of one successful election contest, and that's a bizarre position to take.
3.05 doesn't use the word quorum. So walk me through why you think the secretary has the authority to first make a judgment as to whether or not there's a quorum.
Minnesota statute 3.06 says thereupon, if a quorum is present, then the body shall elect a presiding officer. So election of a presiding officer is not in order unless a quorum is present.
And don't you guys usually appoint Murphy to be the temporary clerk? The statute says you appoint a member to be the temporary clerk. I don't remember you doing that.
So there's a clerk pro tem. That is a person who reads the names. That's a different person than the Secretary of State, who's the presiding officer at all times.
But it says that the clerk pro tem should be a member who's present, and Murphy's not a member. I know I'm quibbling.
Murphy.
I mean, you're chief clerk. You would normally then take the role. I'm quibbling
So-
only because if he has to appoint a Republican member to be the person calling the roll, then that person can say things like, Mr. Secretary, a quorum is present.
No, actually, it's pretty clear what the clerk pro tem simply reads the names of the members, I believe, in either in alphabetical order or in district order. And then it is the Secretary of State that then states whether a quorum is present or not.
And Ruth Richardson did that for us.
Yeah, we've had Paul Marquardt do it. When you said Murphy, I thought you were referring to Mary Murphy, because I'm still in the heartbreak of Christmas week. But Representative Murphy, I believe, was our clerk pro tem in 2019, and then I think Ruth Richardson in 2021, and Paul Marquardt was at some point. So I would presume, and when we were having the negotiations on power sharing, what I said to Leader Damath is, I've been elected speaker before, you haven't, why don't you choose the clerk pro tem, you choose the preacher. I suggested that the Chief Justice would be a good person to swear us in, because of the historic nature of her position and the historic nature of Leader Damath being the first person of color elected speaker. So those are all things that, you know, we don't have any problem with who is the person appointed to be clerk pro tem, because that person doesn't really do anything other than read a list of names. And there is no clerk unless a quorum is present, and then a presiding officer is elected, and then the chief clerk is elected. So there will not be technically a clerk until a quorum is present and those procedures can be followed.
How long do you guys maintain the walkout?
Michelle.
You previously referenced the 54A successful election contest. Why seat Representative Tabke then and not wait for the judge's ruling?
So the swearing in of an individual has no bearing on an election contest. In 1979, Pavlak was sworn in at the beginning of the 1979 session, even though his election contest was still pending at the Minnesota Supreme Court. And the fact that he had been sworn in did not have any impact on the Minnesota Supreme Court's consideration of the issues in the Pavlak case, nor did it have any impact on the House's then ability to remove Pavlak and declare a vacancy. So the fact that Pavlak had an election certificate and was sworn in was separate from the election contest. Similarly, as being sworn in is a ministerial act, and the House itself controls judging its election returns, swearing in of Brad Tabke has no impact on the election contest in court, and it has no impact on the election contest in the Minnesota House of Representatives.
And the GOP wants to have it both ways on this, because they're saying that if a court comes out in Tabke's case in favor of Brad Tabke, that they can ignore the court, right? And then they themselves can kick out Brad, which they've said they will do, but still the court can tell us that we can't have a member take the oath, that doesn't make any sense, right? We are able to have members take the oath and then are able to judge our own members' qualifications, but never in state history have we had a court say that a member is qualified and then overruled that court.
Well, in fact, there have been several times where, for one reason or another, a presiding officer has stated that they weren't going to swear in somebody with an election certificate, and the Minnesota Supreme Court has ordered that those individuals have to be sworn in. So I think Rudy Perpich, when he was lieutenant governor, didn't want to swear somebody in. And then there was another instance where the Minnesota Senate kind of went rogue, and the Chief Justice was there to swear in a bunch of members, and they said, oh, you can swear in everybody, but you can't swear in this one guy. We don't want you to seat. I believe it was Palmer. And the Minnesota Supreme Court said, well, the Chief Justice was like, I'm out of here. I'm either swearing in everybody or nobody. And they had a notary public come to the front of the chamber and swear everybody else in. But then the Minnesota Supreme Court ordered that that individual be sworn in.
Thank you.
Sorry.
How long are you prepared to maintain this walkout, and does the threat of a recall coming from the GOP impact that at all?
No, we're not worried about the threat of a recall because they've filed recalls before. They filed a sort of a fleet of them in 2019, and they were all dismissed. They don't have the grounds for a recall. We're doing our jobs. We plan to be very actively doing our jobs. A small part of our job is going to House floor session, but the vast majority of our job is interacting with constituents and interacting with elected officials in our communities and bringing their concerns here to the state capitol. What I am worried about is that if the Republicans declare kangaroo court and they're going to violate Minnesota statutes 3.05 and 3.06, that we may have to consider recall petitions for malfeasance.
So if no agreement tonight, will you definitely not be in the Capitol tomorrow, you or none of your members?
That's right. And again, there's no reason for us to get there because we absolutely can come to a compromise agreement. Typically, the Minnesota House leads the Minnesota Senate, and so it's really embarrassing for the institution that they reached a deal before we did. But they have taken the blueprint that Leader Dameth and I negotiated, and they used that blueprint. Now, we need to take the blueprint back, and we need to apply it in the House. I'm sure there are some different timing issues that we'll deal with over here. I'm happy to talk about that with Leader Dameth. We had some offers back and forth on Saturday and Sunday, and I'm looking forward to speaking with Leader Dameth this evening. I'm still confident that this can be resolved.
But you will not be even physically in the Capitol, none of your members?
Well, I'm not going to say that because we're not done negotiating.
Will members of your caucus be paid now that they've taken the oath tomorrow if they're not here at the Capitol?
Yes.
This whole dispute kind of really rests with Brad Tapke and your deep concerns that Republicans will throw him out regardless of what a judge says. But what if a judge says there should be a new election? Is this all settled now? If you were waiting for the judge to say what she's going to say, if the judge agrees with the Republicans' position, do you back off from walking out?
Well, we have to see what the decision says. The decision could say one of three things. It could say we rule that we think a special election is appropriate. They could say we punt it to the legislature, or they could say we find that Brad Tapke won by the evidence that was submitted at trial. The outcome would not have been different but for the irregularities that occurred in the city of Shakopee. And so we'll have to see what the judge's decision is. In the Pavlak case, remember, Pavlak won at the trial court and lost at the Minnesota Supreme Court. So until we see what the decision is and we see whether it's a case that will go up to the Minnesota Supreme Court or not, we can't really say that. But what we do believe is it was very clear at trial. They identified precisely the 20 voters whose ballots were inadvertently thrown away by a Shakopee City employee. Sounds like without malice and without intent to change election results, purely by accident. They called 12 of the 20 voters in, and 6 of them testified they voted for Aaron Paul, and 6 of them testified that they voted for Brad Tapke, creating a mathematical impossibility that Aaron Paul could have won that race. And in fact, creating a mathematical certainty that Brad Tapke won the race. We see that. We think the Republicans see that. We think the members of the public saw that after the trial. And, you know, we will take a look at the judge's decision when it's issued.
You said that the denying quorum is the more humane way of protest, that you could just talk and talk and talk. I'm wondering if you're thinking of all doing that, considering, you know, the Republicans are threatening action against you for not showing up, would you show up and do the alternative?
Well, I have watched over the years as different folks have decided to filibuster, and I've watched what that does physically to the people in the chamber, particularly the nonpartisan staff who have no choice. They have to stay. We had 4 different members in the emergency room. I learned from Leader Damath during our negotiations on power sharing, actually, that I believe they had 2 different members who went to the emergency room during their 3-week filibuster in May. And so when I considered all the options that our caucus could choose to follow, giving 66 presiding officer nominations with 66 nominating speeches for each one of them, I think it gets us in the 4,000 speech range, is certainly a possibility. But to do that with people's families in the chamber, to do that to the staff, to do that to the Republican members who we're really anxious to work with, you know, it seems like not the preferred way to go when the other parliamentary tool available to us is to deny quorum. It's kind of a silent filibuster and a much kinder filibuster, including to all of you, because I'm sure you don't want to cover all of our nominating speeches for one another to be presiding officer for the next 3 weeks.
Could you characterize your conversations with Lisa Damon? Meaning, have there been any indication that they're fruitful? Has there been any progress in any, or is it just he said, or she said, she said?
They were very fruitful until January 5th. And then, right. And then, you know, this is what happens in legislative negotiations. You get to a point where it seems you've got an impasse and you're not going to be able to get past it. And then somebody thinks of something that nobody thought of before and you start to find a way to get through it. Or you find that you're at the end of the runway, and so you start to relook at all the things that have been put on the table so far. Our negotiations haven't stopped, and I'm looking forward to talking to her this evening.
If there's no agreement this evening, tomorrow goes forward as kind of we've been discussing here, what would the first day, like the first actual day of the legislature look like? Would it just be like the first day of the session delayed a couple of weeks and Secretary Simon would be there, and we just have kind of the same pomp and circumstance on, you know, January, February, whatever it is?
Well, I think it would be a wasted opportunity if we don't have an agreement and go in tomorrow. The Republicans have 3 weeks where they can function fully as a majority, and we're willing to accommodate that. We can have an election of Lisa Damath as Speaker of the House. We can have all the Republicans chair committees and have 3 weeks of hearings. So I think if we fail to reach an agreement, it's a failed opportunity to use this next 21-day period where they have the 1 vote edge to do some things that Republicans have probably wanted to do for the 6 years they've been in the minority. I know what it's like to be in the minority. It sucks. It's not fun. So why not take this opportunity, this moment, have a precursor portion of session where they're in control, and then have a portion of session where we're tied and we're sharing power.
I guess what I'm asking is, would the Secretary of State preside over the House, you know, whenever this situation resolves itself, whenever you guys are back to 67 members, and start off the session then?
Right. I mean, I think if there's a denial of quorum until our new member is sworn in on February 3rd, then every day there would be a quorum call, and the Secretary would say a quorum is not present, and then on February 3rd, if we don't have an agreement, we would have dueling motions for presiding officer that would net out at 67-67, and until we have an agreement, we would be stuck in what you could call a doom loop of tied votes.
Getting back to the swearing in last night, did you have to rent that space? They're not generally open that time of night on a Sunday. Who paid for that, and who all was in attendance?
Yeah, I believe that our campaign paid for the Minnesota History Center, so we used political side resources for that. And the people who were in attendance were members-elect who became members and their families. We limited returning members to just a few guests, 1 per. I don't remember if you brought anybody. And then for new members, we let them have a few more because we knew, you know, for the new members, this is a little bit of a disappointing start to the legislative session.
And how was Judge Burke selected for that role?
Well, he's a senior judge in Hennepin County District Court. He, in that position, will not be in a position to get any cases that could come out of the beginning of the Minnesota legislative session. So we did not want a judge that could be called upon in the Minnesota Supreme Court, who is typically swears in the members, to be involved in something that they may later have to judge.
I think most of us in this room were here for the end of last session, which ended with a lot of acrimony. And Republicans were mad that you did what you did, which was pass the unfinished business in a giant bill, and you said you could do it. Why is what you did different than what Republicans want to do now?
Because we had a majority sent by the voters. The voters elected Democratic majorities in the Minnesota House and the Senate and the governor's residence. Similar end of session fast consideration of bills has been done by then Speaker Kurt Doudt. And so if you look through the archives, you'll find that the tape of the end of the 2024 session is rather similar to the tape of the end of the 2017 session and the 2015 session. And that is what happens when a majority has to govern and a minority wants to get in the way. That is something that happens here at the Minnesota House of Representatives, and it's not personal. It is a result of decisions made by the voters that affect the balance of power here. What we're in right now is this very unique situation where voters have given equal power to both parties.
We also
Are you
followed.
advising any members from swing districts not to accept the pay and the per diem during the no-show?
You know, we haven't had that conversation. I remember in 2011 when we had the government shut down for 3 weeks and I didn't take my pay. And I learned later then that it didn't go back in the coffers in the Minnesota House of Representatives. It actually went in the Republicans' travel budget. So I think we certainly will have conversations about what people want to do with per diem down the road.
It doesn't say specifically in your letter, but I'm presuming your proposal to the Rs also would include their commitment to not try to unseat Pat.
Absolutely.
Is there any other authority besides Simon that could kind of act as a party in all of this that you're aware of?
No, the Minnesota statutes 3.05 declares how the first day of session proceeds, and it decides that the lieutenant governor is the presiding officer in the Minnesota Senate and that the Secretary of State is the presiding officer in the Minnesota House. The thing about, actually both Steve Simon and Peggy Flanagan, is they have experience serving in the Minnesota House. And they both know without a doubt that a quorum is 68. It's not a hard question. So.
How will the general public know where their representatives are if they're not at the Capitol and want to speak with them?
They will see us on social media in our communities, meeting with folks, and it'll be the same as it is when we are here in committees where they will send us email and say, do you want to have a cup of coffee, or do you want to get together in district, or can we come see you at your office at the Capitol, and we'll respond, and we'll get together with constituents from our district.
They can be in Centennial. Y'all can be in Centennial, right?
We can.
What time are you meeting with Damon tonight?
We have to nail that down completely. We have an approximate time.
How much concern is there about just the optics of all of this if you don't show up on the first day or the first 2 weeks of session?
Well, no, to be sure, we don't love it. We really believe that we should be in a situation where we have a power sharing agreement right now with Republicans. We did not turn to denial of quorum lightly. It has never been done in Minnesota. It has been done in lots of other states. But the reason we have to consider it is this very extreme action that Republicans are threatening. The idea that any party who has more votes than the other party would come in and kick out any member they want just because they can. And in fact, in conversations with Republicans, it hasn't been clear that they're going to stop at one. So that is so outrageous, that action of threatening to overturn the will of the voters. We only have two options. One is filibuster and the other is denial of quorum.
What does that mean that they're not going to stop at one? What are they talking about?
They have implied that there are other election contests that they would like to run because they're proposing different rules for Representative Tabke as opposed to other election contests.
But if you, let's say you're in 67, 66, and they've got 2 sick people, and it's now 65, 64. Do you read their read that you start taking action, maybe remove a member?
Well, absolutely, and isn't that silly? Like, why do we really want to play games like that? Rod Searle in 1979 did it the right way. You know, to be frank, Irv Anderson was a jerk in those negotiations. So when along came the first day of session and the Republicans had a temporary one-seat advantage because a Democrat had had a heart attack, lots of Republicans said to Rod Searle, take it, dude, take it. And he said, that would be short-sighted. We have to work together. We can't pass a bill without them. We've negotiated a power sharing agreement. Let's honor it. I am asking Representative Dama to do the same thing that Rod Searle did in 1979, put the relationships of the members and the dignity of the institution ahead of the most partisan urges in her caucus.
Does remote voting include floor and committee?
It has, yes.
And it takes some of the drama out of it, doesn't it, if you got remote voting?